Sepia Prison. We're using Bill Clinton as the cover of this video, because his name is the one most people already associate with mass incarceration. But that story doesn't start with him. It starts 23 years earlier with a man who never once used the words mass incarceration in public because he didn't need to. He just needed the cameras rolling. This isn't the story historians usually tell you. This is the story hiding underneath it. The Declaration. June 17, 1971. Richard Nixon walks into the White House briefing room and tells the American public that drug abuse is now public enemy number one in the United States. He tells reporters he just finished a 2-hour meeting with bipartisan leaders about it. Within a day, newspapers across the country are calling it something else entirely, a war. The phrase war on drugs gets attached to Nixon's initiative almost overnight, even though his actual message to Congress that day had also emphasized treatment and rehabilitation, a detail the headlines buried completely. By January 1972, Nixon creates the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, ODALE, a new federal task force built to run coordinated drug raids across the country. 18 months later, ODALE merges with several other agencies into a new superagency, the Drug Enforcement Administration. The DEA is born. On paper, this is a public health initiative. In practice, it's the birth of the machinery that will eventually incarcerate more people than any nation in recorded history. Here's what most people don't learn until decades later. In 1994, Nixon's own domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, sat down with journalist Dan Baum for an interview that wouldn't be published until 2016, 2 years after Ehrlichman's death. In that interview, Ehrlichman said the Nixon campaign had two enemies in 1968, the anti-war left and black Americans. He admitted they couldn't legally criminalize opposing the war or being black, so instead, the campaign worked to publicly associate hippies with marijuana and black communities with heroin. Criminalize both heavily enough, he said, and you could disrupt both movements, raid their homes, arrest their leaders, break up their meetings. Ehrlichman didn't frame this as an accident. He said plainly that they knew they were lying about the drugs. That's the founding sentence of the modern war on drugs, not a public health crisis, a political weapon aimed at two specific groups of American citizens dressed up as a moral crusade. For most of the 1970s, the drug war stays relatively contained, a growing bureaucracy, but not yet a prison-building machine. That changes in 1981, when Ronald Reagan takes office and turns Nixon's rhetorical war into a literal one. Reagan shifts the entire strategy from treatment toward punishment. His wife Nancy launches "Just Say No." But the real transformation happens in the sentencing guidelines, not the slogans. Under Reagan, the number of Americans incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses explodes from roughly 50,000 people in 1980 to nearly 400,000 by the time Reagan's policies finish working their way through the system in the late 1990s. Then, in June 1986, University of Maryland basketball star Len Bias dies of a cocaine overdose just 2 days after being drafted by the Boston Celtics. His death triggers a media panic, and Congress responds within weeks. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 becomes law. Buried inside it is a sentencing rule that will define the next 3 decades of American incarceration. 5 grams of crack cocaine, worth roughly the same as a few dollars on the street, now carries the same mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. 100 to 1. Congress considered other ratios during the debate, including 20 to 1, and settled on 100 to 1 with no scientific evidence to justify the number. Here's the part historians gloss over. Crack and powder cocaine are chemically almost identical, but crack was cheaper, which meant it reached poorer, disproportionately black communities, while powder stayed the drug of choice in wealthier, whiter ones. The chemistry didn't justify the disparity. The economics of who was buying which version did. The result: the rate of black Americans sent to federal prison jumps from roughly 50 per 100,000 adults to roughly 250 per 100,000 in the years following the law. One law. A 5 times increase. Part 3: The Cover. By 1994, violent crime had been climbing for years, up more than 15% between 1986 and 1994 alone. Bill Clinton, determined not to let Republicans own the tough-on-crime narrative, signs the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, the largest crime bill in American history, at over $30 billion. The bill funds 100,000 new police officers. It bans certain assault weapons. It also does something else. It hands states nearly $9 billion to build new prisons, but only if they adopt truth in sentencing, laws requiring violent offenders to serve at least 85% of their sentence. It expands the federal death penalty to dozens of new crimes. It creates a 3 strikes provision mandating life sentences after a 3rd felony conviction. Here's the twist historians argue about constantly. The 1994 crime bill did not start mass incarceration. The numbers were already climbing hard for 2 decades before Clinton ever signed anything, driven by Nixon's declaration, Reagan's sentencing laws, and state-level policies that had nothing to do with Washington. What the 1994 bill did was pour federal gasoline on a fire that was already burning, and hand every state a financial incentive to keep building more prison cells. By the time incarceration in America peaks in 2008, U.S. prisons and jails hold roughly 2.3 million people, nearly a quarter of the entire world's prisoner population, in a country with less than 5% of the world's people. So why does Clinton's face end up on this story instead of Nixon's or Reagan's? Because Clinton later admitted, in a 2015 NAACP speech, that the tougher sentencing provisions in his bill were a mistake. Reagan never said that. Nixon never got the chance. Ehrlichman's confession only surfaced after both men were gone. Clinton's regret became the public face of a machine 3 presidents actually built. Part 4: Where it stands now. The system built between 1971 and 1994 didn't stop growing after Clinton left office. George W. Bush and Barack Obama both continued aspects of the drug war, though Obama's administration pushed the first real rollback. The 2010 Fair Sentencing Act cut the crack-to-powder disparity from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1, still not equal, but a fraction of what it was. In 2018, the First Step Act passed with bipartisan support, expanding early release programs and reducing some federal mandatory minimums. Incarceration numbers, which had been slowly falling since their 2008 peak, dropped sharply during the pandemic in 2020. But that decline has reversed. As of 2026, roughly 1.9 to 2 million people are incarcerated in the United States across state prisons, federal prisons, and local jails, and the U.S. still locks up more of its own citizens, per capita, than almost any other nation on Earth. Drug offenses alone still account for a significant share of the federal prison population. And in the past year, expanded immigration detention has become the fastest-growing part of the entire system. 55 years after Nixon stood in that briefing room and declared drug abuse public enemy number 1, the machine he built, expanded by Reagan, funded by Clinton, is still running. This is the story historians don't lead with. Now you know why.